Hello, and welcome as we look forward now to celebrating this weekend, the 31st Sunday of the year. And the scripture readings will be first reading from the prophet Malachi, chapter 1, verses 14b to chapter 2, verse 2b. And then verses 8 to 10. So they do a bit of editing there with those readings. The second reading is from Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, again, chapter 2, verses 6 through 9 and 13. Again, they jump around there. And finally, Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 12. All right, now we have been listening throughout this year to the gospel tradition according to Matthew, as you remember, our major guide. And as we come to chapter 23, which we will hear sections of this time, it presents a very stinging denunciation by Jesus of the scribes and the Pharisees who have been cast as his opponents throughout this gospel. Now, we've mentioned this on other occasions, and as we're coming now toward the end of Matthew's story this year, it is perhaps important once again to notice, particularly in this chapter, which we're only going to have the opening 12 verses, as I say, the attack on the part of Jesus is to the Pharisees and to the scribes. Now, previous to this, as you remember, Jesus had been tested and challenged by the elders and the leaders. Now we go back to, and in this gospel, the Pharisees come off very negatively in many cases. We have mentioned before that we need to be careful on how the understanding here is taking place. Because in this gospel, and remember that it was written some 15 to 20 years or so, perhaps, after the fall of the city of Jerusalem in the year 70, that many of the smaller groups who advocated a way of living out the Jewish tradition had, for all intent and purposes, disappeared. The group that emerges in a new way and in a stronger way as the leadership of Judaism were the Pharisees. Now, that's important to notice because, as we've noticed on a number of occasions in Matthew's gospel, the Pharisees ought to be and are appreciated as the Pharisees of Matthew's time, not necessarily as the Pharisees of Jesus' time. Pharisees in Jesus' time were one of many. You remember different understandings of how Jewish life should be lived. In fact, we think there were perhaps about 20, although the only ones that are remembered are those which the Gospels choose to remember, such as the Sadducees, the Zealots, are a couple that are known there. All right, now what is the tension? The tension here is that there is a conflict between the emerging new understanding of how Jewish tradition should be lived, spearheaded by the Pharisees, and the Christians. Christian Pharisees, if you want. And I know that sounds strange, but keep in mind that that's the tension between Matthew's community and the new emerging leadership within Judaism. Now, therefore, some harsh things are said, and I stress this because sometimes in the past, this gospel, particularly the way in which Jesus is pictured as addressing the scribes and Pharisees, is very negative. Well, why is that? Because there is a tension between the Christian Jews and the Pharisaic Jews. Now, one thing also to keep in mind, although this is lost as time goes on, there was often a healthy tension or fighting that went on between groups within Judaism. They could even call each other names at some point. Much like, I'm not advocating this, but sometimes in family fights, people call names to one or the other of the family, and they get it, and they understand that that's the way it's done, and may not even take it quite so literally, although we have to be careful in making that conclusion. So again, we very literally often interpret what Jesus is pictured as saying in Matthew's gospel. So all of that, again, is a review as we move now in these days toward the end of listening to Matthew's gospel, why that is often so tension-filled. We have frequently described the Pharisees, and so I won't go into that today again, this group. Perhaps a little bit of background with regard to the scribes. Now, the scribes were originally and primarily those who exercised the occupation of copying documents and contracts for government officials and for others with authority. So obviously the scribes were those who could read and write and were therefore quite familiar with whatever material was being distributed among the people at that time, because they had that ability. In the book of Sirach, which is written about 200 years prior to Jesus' time, the scribes begin to involve themselves in affairs of government and function as the intellectuals. After all, they're the ones that can read and write. And so in Matthew, when they appear, the scribes, they are both members of this learned class, but they are also part of Jewish leadership. And so for that reason, one finds Jesus, therefore, arguing with the scribes and Pharisees. See, so at that point, we suspect that many of the scribal background may have come from the Pharisees, although that's not absolutely conclusion. Now, Jesus in this chapter and in this gospel here takes on the role of a prophet. And you remember that the classic prophets would attack fellow Jews and would often use, "Woe, if you don't do this." In fact, we're not going to hear a lot of those in the reading this time because they're in the rest of chapter 23. But in there are levied Jesus against the people. Woe to those, woe to those. And that is, again, the style that many of the prophets used. And again, we remember how indebted Matthew is to the Jewish tradition. So Jesus here is pictured as warning the crowds and his disciples not to follow the hypocritical practices of their leaders, who do not practice what they preach or what they teach. Now, again, there's a kind of compliment here being made, because Jesus is recognizing that the Pharisees and the scribes are competent to exercise leadership, but it is not in the script exactly how that they don't live. Jesus calls them, in fact, although that doesn't appear here, but in the latter part of chapter 23, and I keep saying in our discussion here to keep that whole chapter in mind, calls them hypocrites or actors. Remember that that's what the Greek word means, to put on a mask, so that they, as we would say, give a good line, but Jesus is saying they don't live it out. If you look to see how their actual example in life was illustrated, it didn't work too well. Now, what also we hear is that, and Jesus had mentioned earlier on in this gospel, that his burden was light. You have to go back to chapter 11, verse 30. where Jesus had said in one of his teachings. Now here, Jesus accuses the Pharisees of laying on heavy burdens which they nicely lay on other people, but they themselves make no effort to lift and make no effort to live. Now, then there's mention that they put on their phylacteries. Now, phylacteries, P-H-Y-L-A-C-T-E-R-I-E-S. What were phylacteries? Well, they were little leather boxes containing parchments. So you can see who wrote the parchments would have been the scribes. Generally containing, as we may have mentioned last time, containing the basic message, love God, love your neighbor. So they were put in these boxes, and then they were said that this should be a sign on your head. So what they would do would strap this box around their forehead at time of prayer. Now, they didn't wear it all the time, but they did wear it at prayer time. And then would also wrap around their one shoulder the straps, again indicating the custom and the prayer that they were about to offer. So that's what all this phylactery is. It will be an emblem on your forehead, says one of the scriptures, and so that's why this box indicates that. As I say, they wore this at the time of the morning prayer. And also that they would elongate with tassels and fringes the corners of their outer garments to remind them also to observe the traditions and customs. Now, some of this is found in the book of Numbers and in the book of Deuteronomy. So, again, there's a kind of Hebraic background for this. Now, what is this heavy load? And this is, we're going to hear Jesus says that they lay on you. Well, remember we mentioned last time that there were heavy, the whole Torah, of course, had what would be called heavy and light. But as far as what goes on here, it's a heavy load. Now, this may have been some reference to the fact that in the first century, there were two reputable Jewish rabbis. One was known as Hillel. We have heard him before, who typically favored a broad interpretation of the law, saying that there were more perhaps light ones than there were heavy ones, and that exceptions could be more appropriately, justly, and needfully made. So how much would they be accused of laying heavy laws? On the other hand was the school of Shammai, S-H-A-M-M-A-I, who argued for a strict, narrow interpretation of the law. And here would be the sense in which a heavy burden was being placed on people. So that again is a little bit of a background to this. Then he goes on to accuse them that they like to have places of honor in the synagogues. They like to be seen. And Jesus obviously is criticizing this because, and they love to receive, and again, this is another part that we're going to hear, deferential titles. Among them, they like to be called rabbi, or which means my Lord, and of course that title should only be given to God, and like to be called Father. Now we have to be very careful here, because Jesus will say that only God should be called Father. Now this is not by the way, and I know, you're going to say, but you call your priest father. That is not what is understood here. That's a much later development and has nothing to do here with what this message on the part of Jesus is. It's pejorative. It's saying that all of those in this Pharisaical Jewish community like those things. And so the point, really, that Jesus' teaching is making, that all of those who are of the Christian Jewish community should be doing none of those things. In fact, the narrative indicates that good followers of Jesus would do the very opposite of what the Pharisees are doing. So you can see how this will open the door to a serious discretion. So, in acknowledging that the scribes and Pharisees have authority, and they had expanded it really at this time, keep in mind in Matthew's time, in three ways. First of all, that Jesus simply acknowledges the de facto fact that they are the community leaders of Israel. Secondly, that is saying that they may encounter this Jewish Christian circle whose teachings Matthew wishes to incorporate and to qualify. So keep in mind that at the same time that there's this tension, there are many things within the believing community of Christians from Judaism that are worth keeping and that are worth honoring. So it isn't, and perhaps important to again stress this, an either or, but in some ways, what is to be taken from the tradition and kept. In fact, in other places in Matthew's gospel, he points that out. You don't throw the whole, as it were, baby out with the bathwater in terms of the tradition of Israel, but you choose that which is appropriate and important when one accepts that Jesus is the Messiah. And so therefore, thirdly, Matthew acknowledges the de facto power of this dominant Jewish community, and wants, us to be aware of it. So when you put all of this together, keep in mind that the author here recognizes, in some ways, the legitimacy of the Pharisees' group. In fact, the phrase is used here: they have inherited the seat of Moses. Now, believe it or not, there were some who for centuries had hoped that archaeologists might discover the seat of Moses. Well, we're pretty sure that that is more a metaphorical term, not an actual seat that existed even in Moses' time. But it does indicate those who have a teaching and a ruling authority. So again, why that phrase we will hear is used. The Pharisees were really, by the time that we're looking here, had assumed also some priestly roles, although they were not ever in Jesus' time part of the priestly group. And by this time, the city of Jerusalem had been destroyed, that is, by the time of Matthew's gospel. So there was no really priestly need to be taken care of in the temple. But nevertheless, we do keep that in mind. So there are all of these kind of things to put it into place. So what we notice here is Jesus really has now offered three objections to the Pharisees. First, the Pharisees and the scribes do not practice what they preach. Second, they adopt a way that is very narrow and burdensome in keeping the Torah. And third, they seek public acknowledgement. So those are certainly one of the points that are being made, and we kind of have highlighted some of those now in our discussions thus far. So Jesus is now pictured. Who's he speaking to? Could he be speaking to his own Christian community? Keep in mind that necessarily the gospel is much more, and we've noticed this on other occasions, inwardly directed rather than to the outsiders. So Jesus is now warning the crowds and his disciples not to follow the hypocritical practices of their leaders who do not practice what they preach. So we've seen this. Jesus then mentions his burden is light and encourages prayer. Certainly that is important, but all of the things, and you have to smile a little bit, but all of the things that the Pharisees, like the Christians, should not be doing. So how well will they be able to live that out, or how well do they live that, is of course something important to notice. The struggle now is between the social or sociological necessity for institutional things. Now this is interesting to some degree because in Matthew's community, there is no one identified leader as such. Now you could say, well, don't you have some leaders? Yes, but the group doesn't have, and this is interesting, what we would call institutionalization yet, which the Pharisee group has. But the Christian community still does not. We have to recognize that very early on, Christian communities begin also the process of institutionalizing. What does that mean? Setting up a group of identifiable leaders who have an exercised ability of authority over the community. And certainly, as we see history unfolding in the Christian story, very early on, we develop that, do we not? Bishops, deacons, leaders of various kinds. So there again is a certain tension. Now, no one is saying we should go back to that, but it is perhaps important that the Matthean community, yes, Peter is pictured as being directed by Jesus to kind of inspire and to lead, but he's not being really made as we would later on interpret his position. So that's a tension also that's going on in this discussion that's going on between Matthew and the Pharisees. When I say Matthew, I mean Matthew's Jesus, okay? And certainly he is keeping very close to his vest, as it were, the essential teachings of Jesus that he has presented throughout the gospel. Moving for a few moments to the prophet Malachi, who we're not sure who this prophet Malachi was, because the word Malachi means my messenger. So it's interesting that is he an identifiable person, or is it simply the title of someone who has leadership? Now, here's what the words of Malachi, which are not included. One of the problems here is the selection, as we often do with Old Testament readings, is take the ones that we want to be particularly applied to the message of the day, but forget a little bit the context. In the verses prior to the ones that we will hear this time, Malachi has said, "A son honors his father, and a servant his master. If then I am father, where is my honor? If I am master, where is my fear?" So what Malachi is then saying, that it is God who deserves the honor and should be respected. Yet the priests in Malachi's time have taken that to themselves, so that they have despised or shamed God. and they do not lay to heart the message that they should have. They do not take God nor their obligations to God seriously. They were to give the Torah instruction, but they do not, and in this case they falter. So all of that lies behind the choice here of Malachi, who then says, and this is what we hear, that they taught falsely about God, that they were more interested in generous donations to themselves. Here is Malachi is talking to the leaders of his own time. And keep in mind, that's, again, what I mentioned very often. It is an inward, in-house, as it were, instruction. And that apparently in Malachi's time, the leaders enjoyed magnificent structures and engaged in religious display. So you can see those are the kind of things that are also mentioned in the gospel this time that the Pharisees and scribes are accused of. And also Malachi is concerned that the leaders of his time are showing partiality, particularly to the rich and to others, and above all, to themselves. So these are very harsh words that Malachi is leveling against certain of the leadership of his time. That maybe helps us appreciate why in Matthew's Jesus story today, he is also laying very harsh words against them. Now, what we will just since we will not be looking at chapter 23 and any further than this, what appears in there are a number of verses, by the way, in chapter 23, verses 13 through 41, 31, and then 32 through 39, are what we would call apocalyptic sayings. So in this sense, Jesus is saying, woe, 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 woe to those who do this, but when the end comes, and it will, they will receive the recompense and justice that they deserve. In fact, from verses 13 through 36, there are a series of 7 woes. And the language, if you read it through, we won't do it here, but if you read it through, become increasingly bitter, so that you can really, if you read this chapter, get the tense anger, if you want, or frustration that is building up on the part of Jesus' teaching toward the Pharisees and the scribes. Now, I mention this, in fairness to Matthew, putting him contextually in his own time and in his own culture, that we should not be doing this in our own time. You need to put in place, as we mentioned throughout the talk this time, that tension which was existing between these two groups. Obviously, the Pharisee Jews did not like the fact that you had this opponent group. Now, we don't know just where this opponent group was and how strong it was. Do not think that Matthew's Jesus teaching was universal around the Mediterranean area. No, it was much more localized. So we are therefore not even sure what particular group of Pharisees are tensioning with the Matthean group at this point. So if you get something from our kind of ramblings this time, that there was a great deal of tension going on, but it was not universal, and it was particularized on the part of Matthew's Jesus to the Pharisee scribes of whatever area they were living in. And so I mention this as we conclude because we want to be careful that, as sometimes in the past, we have universalized this tension to all of Judaism by all of Christians, and that certainly has not been the case. But there is much to learn from Matthew's section this time. Perhaps we should be careful that we don't take honors to ourselves, but always give, as Matthew's Jesus encourages, the honor, the devotion, the respect to God. And it is, therefore, God whom we call Father. And so we notice the great prayer that we say so regularly, Our Father. And that belongs, certainly that beautiful title, to God. And we do that in our prayer. Thank you for being with us. I hope to see you again.